benefit of the House, the motion is that this House believes that a cut in India's social spending is essential to provide India's manufacturing prowess, paving a way for wide-scale employment and higher GDP. Right? So we have to understand that one, we're cutting social spending, right? You're not handing over social spending or social infrastructure development to private sectors through which you're necessarily drawing private sectors from the manufacturing industry into providing social services, which is something as a harm they should have talked about or discussed, right? Because you're necessarily now providing less Kellogg's, less Nike, less this private goods and manufactured goods, and forcing these private industries to invest more in social spending. But anyway, the motion here stands for us primarily because we both agree that social inclusion is the end. And for them, providing social inclusion is an ambit that they're leaving for private sector, right? We argue that private sector necessarily lacks the incentive to invest unless it sees profits, right? Unless it sees that if I invest 500 rupees, I'll get 600 as a sum total, for which we believe that it will charge exorbitant fees over a large period of time, right? Furthermore, we're saying that this is not a long-term solution, because what this does is the government then has no incentive to build its own capacity in social services and will forever rely on private sector to provide these services, right? What happens because of that? Private sectors get more lobbying power, right? The private sector can decide what medicines it provides in these hospitals that it's set up, what sort of curriculum it has in these schools that it's set up. Furthermore, it can also dictate the employment within these sectors of social services, right? We believe that private sector thus necessarily gets a larger push in social sector provision and not in manufacturing industries. Furthermore, we believe that when you just analyze this sort of idea of profit motive, we believe that the government will have to subsidize, one, the creation of all of these infrastructures, these schools, these hospitals, these line posts, these yada, 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 in all of these districts across the country. Furthermore, it has to make these sectors and areas accessible by the poor, which something that I've talked about and we've talked about in all of our speeches. The poor are necessarily always going to remain in the bottom rungs, at least economically and socially speaking, right? They're never going to get the access inherently. So the government will have to subsidize them for them. What necessarily comes out of that? We're telling you that what comes out of this is a money crunch, right? In their first speech, they say there is no money. Well, the government is already failing investing in welfare, but no money. Suddenly, they get an abundance of money when they can make migration possible in cities all around the country, because there's going to be an influx from rural countries, rural areas which employ almost 60% of our population. Furthermore, they're going to subsidize private sectors in investing in social schemes. Furthermore, they're going to subsidize access by poor of all of these services. We don't know how this money is going to come if not taxation, if not primary debt from other countries. Leaving that aside, what is the principle of this debate, right? We're expecting a debate that talks about manufacturing and thus explaining how trickle-down can happen and how social inclusion can happen through economy rather than social inclusion happening through political intervention in these social paradigms. If you look at just the poor people and the people who do not have rights to education, rights to healthcare, and rights to a proper means of livelihood and an honorable means of livelihood. We're telling you that they've pussyfooted out of this debate, right? They've not talked about things like manufacturing sector and trickle-down effect, where we necessarily throughout historical analysis, throughout our speeches, we've talked about through capitalism, the transition from feudalism to capitalism only benefited the merchant classes and the nobility, and not the serfs and the peasants, who still were propagated under the zamindari system to produce heavy agricultural produce for the manufacturing industries at very, very, very subnormal rates. Anyway, we talk no indulgence on trickle-down effect, right? Furthermore, no indulgence on the provision of opportunities to the poor. They're just saying we're going to subsidize education to the poor and we're going to subsidize all of this to the poor. But how are we going to get the money and the time and the effort to bolster private investment in all of these sectors and then push the government exclusively out of all investment in any sector that the government can ever indulge in? Because according to them, it should always be given to the private sector because, hey, it's more efficient. Why is it more efficient? Because of profit. But we're telling you necessarily, which is a large point we've made, is this virtuous cycle that we've talked about. We're talking about how when you invest in this as the government, as what Scandinavia has done, we can make a virtuous cycle where government can invest and lead to
I'd like to thank the opposition whip speaker for giving us a protected whip speech and bringing in new philosophical arguments like we should attack the principle. Here's the argument, we don't have to. All of us know milk is good for infants. The question is this, should you give your child mother's breast milk or milk from mother dairy counter. That's simply the argument we are saying. We are arguing for breast milk, they are arguing for mother dairy milk, and that's the argument. We do not need to question the fundamental principle that milk is good for a child to negate the argument that like you should give the child mother dairy milk. That is not what we are doing. Now, like translating that onto the plane of the debate, what has been our argument so far? Our argument so far has been governmental investment is consistently inefficient because incentive structures are misaligned and there is no oversight. We consistently gave you examples of like inefficiency in education sector highlighted through the Pratham survey. And even though teachers and employees in public schools make far more than like teachers in private school, far more than what Paddy does, like with all his credentials. They still make much more than they do. College professors in public governmental colleges still make a lot more than what like private colleges do. So again, this is the same arguments we have been making so far. If the government is providing the service, if the government is acting as a provider of the service, it has to invest in infrastructure, it has to invest in employees, administration, bureaucracy, that whole chain of like command in which you need to pump in money, as opposed to the private sector, which probably has like 3 or 4 teachers teaching the entire class and like 1 principal administering it, thereby like having a leaner and like a more streamlined system. Like we don't really understand like why throughout, even after 3 speeches, they still have not understood, and they still keep questioning how we are going to make those savings. The saving is simply this: you need to spend lesser amount in private sector because private employees are paid lesser, they are run tightly, and like you don't have to pay your public sector teachers as high a salary as the public sector. Now, how is this going to be a cut? Like, let's look at the motion. We know that like the motion has like at least 3 burdens. We need to show that like we need to cut social spending. Then we need to show that that will lead to like manufacturing boost, and finally show that that will lead to like increase in employment and GDP. Both sides have not like shown all those links. The debate has largely been about whether or not you should cut funding and move from one model to the other. Now, how did we win that debate? We showed you that there exists the possibility, like very high possibility of making a major saving when you shift from that model to our model. What has been their argument? Their arguments have been historical analysis by pointing out isolated instances like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Well, we also gave you instances of North Korea and South Korea, so we don't think argument through example stand. They need to give you structural arguments as to why going through all these layers of bureaucracies, all these layers of like middlemen with misaligned incentives is structurally better than resorting and using the private sector. Now, their argument is private sector will not come because there are no profits. We told you we are giving them a vouchers. They can go ahead and consume the same quantity of services and like food products or whatever they're consuming right now without the need for any of these like middlemen. So the amount of profit remains constant to the private sector. They still have not understood our model, and that's why they're going to lose this debate, because the profit pool available to the private sector remains a constant. Now, they also need to argue why that extreme case will hold throughout India, hold on an average. Their case where like whatever Haryanvi village they were talking about, that's a Haryanvi village, and that by fact means that that's an extreme case. That's not what the general India looks like, and that's again like one of our major arguments. In general, there is no reason why the government should run a primary school in Delhi, because like the private sector can already go ahead and do that. And that is generally true for India. Even in urban centers, you still see the government going ahead and doing these things that the private sector can go ahead and do much more efficiently. And that is why we deserve to win this debate, because their case has entirely been run on an extreme side, whereas we have argued on the average and shown you marginal benefits.
I would like to invite our adjudicator, Pradyumna, to come and share the result and share his thoughts on the debate.
Okay, firstly, I have no thoughts. I haven't had any thoughts on debates for the past 3.5 years. That's when I started teaching. I judged 4 debates in school today. I didn't give any result because I was only giving feedback. It sounds a little cliched, but I adjudicate and don't adjudicate anymore. So that's why I don't come back to debates in Delhi University and elsewhere. But I hope my students are doing well in Hansraj and Stephens. I hope they're carrying forward a certain debating legacy there. Coming to the debate here, Yeah, okay. So I got to know this debate and I approached it from the perspective of what the motion was asking about, that a cut in social spending is needed. The essence of what I got in this debate was that a lot of context was missing from proposition and opposition. I'll just firstly give out the result because I know you guys hate it when people adjudicate a start like this. Through a close margin, the motion that was proposed has fallen. Debate goes to opposition. That does not mean that side opposition was free from certain faults. But first, coming to the proposition, the aspect of the essence of this debate is you have to tell me why is this debate happening today, right? Why is this debate taking place? So if I go back to my sheets of paper, if I find the PM speech here, I take a look at need and I take a look at benefit, right? He talks about one thing. He talks about status quo, how there is a welfare state, there's a problem of channeling of benefit, and there's wasteful expenditure. Fair enough. That's one argument for why this debate is taking place. But the reason why this debate is taking place is for a plethora of reasons which were lacking, right? Which was a huge problem. And if I come down to the government whip speech, when he talks about a point which I don't think he realized the significance of, because when he talks about how all of this money is channeled, all of this money is wasted, all this money is done only for mere political symbolism, and it just enhances bureaucratic impediments. That's a very important point, because the reason why this debate is happening today is that many schemes that are introduced are only introduced as mere symbolic statements. They are not carried forward to the level in which they are required to do, thereby indicating a failure of the welfare state model. There is a certain perspective that you have to provide to me to tell me that in today's environment, when welfare schemes are carried out, they are not carried out in account with the principle of welfare to the people, but rather it is done for mere political symbolism, and governments merely channel these funds for their own benefit. There is no actual benefit going down there. That is something which I was looking for, particularly in this context. I know you guys will accuse me of entering the debate, but unfortunately in this type of a debate, I do have to enter the debate because there is a lot of context that is missing here. The second thing, you are talking about you guys made it into a model of vouchers versus government investment in education. Of course, the debate is much more than that. But even if you restrict this ambit of the debate to education, I seriously thought that you guys should have harped upon this and taken it to an opportunity for yourself. Because the problem, if we understand it today, and I'm no expert, I just read what is given to me in the form of online journals, articles, newspapers, etc., etc. But the problem is that why is there a push towards the manufacturing sector? You've seen it happen. I come from JNU. We've got so many graduates. We've got so many postgraduates. We've got so many PhD scholars. You come from, you know people in the IIMs, you know people in these other universities. There is no problem of graduates. There is no problem of education. The problem is, where are these graduates going to go? Right? That is the problem here. Therefore, the impetus is for you to shift from the social sector, because it's not necessarily a problem. And here you can use parliamentary parlance here. You can say, look, we've got this amount of graduates already in place. What do we do with them? Right? What do we do with them? And the fact of the matter is, what you do with them is that you take the money that you have, you shift it from the social sector, and you invest it into the manufacturing sector, because that's what gets people into jobs. That's what's getting them to require what they need. Their essence is, why are people... What was the essence of this अच्छे दिन? The essence of this अच्छे दिन was jobs चाहिए लोगों को, employment चाहिए लोगों को. The essence of that is, therefore, this debate is taking place because people want a shift of priorities of the government. That is the essence which you missed out. As far as the opposition is concerned, and this will tie into what a question was asked about, Gandhi and, villages, etc., right? The problem is that the opposition's analysis of what exactly is the problem with respect to expenditure only comes out in a reply speech. For those of you not familiar with parliamentary debates, the first three speeches are what you call constructive speech arguments, where the essence of the debate must come out. Anything which comes out in a reply speech is considered to be a little unfair, or as many colleges term it, slimy. But I will use the term unfair here. The essence was that there is an increase, you were talking about the fact that private sectors are only going by profit. You talked about, yes, feudalism, capitalism, mercantilism, etc. Standard textbook left-wing, stuff. But the essence was to contextualize it to today. The essence, what you had to do was to tell me that private sector कि जब तुम responsibility दोगे उसका impact क्या होता है. And here you talk about you needed to clarify once again that the government expenditure is not going to decrease but rather increase, which you said in assertive statements throughout your speeches. But then I think Dhruv in his reply speech came up and said that no, what you're doing is the expenditure is only going to go up because the demand is going to go up for the private sector. What I was waiting for you to tell me was that when supposing, and you have to give me this kind of an analysis, right? If even in the private sector, right, there is a tendency for your foodstuffs, for your essentials whose prices to go up. You were talking about your McDonald's, you were talking about your Nikes, right? When they go up, what happens is that the prices go up and lesser people can afford it. Similarly, the sustainability of the voucher system lies in the fact that the government will have to keep on producing vouchers as prices keep on increasing. So therefore, the government expenditure is not necessarily decreasing, but rather it's increasing. And therefore, it's becoming more of a burden on the government taken to this particular model, not your particular model, which I felt was a flaw in your part because you had 2 speeches to argue that out. But it only comes out crystallized in a particular reply speech. Which brings me to the point of which model is going to be best suited in this particular debate. The model of providing vouchers, which yes, absolutely correct. In a principle sense, it does sound very good when the government is decentralizing its responsibility. But you also need to elaborate to me how it's going to be beneficial for the government to give this kind of a responsibility to the private sector, which I felt that the opposition was able to counter with arguments which were much more of a sound nature when they said that, look, yes, even though a private sector is bound by certain notions of profit, the idea of the private sector being involved in this is not going to be beneficial because it goes against the idea of the welfare state. And here I'd just like to bring in the point about the village and, the question that was asked here. One essential argument that was clearly missing from your speech was the lack of mobility, particularly among oppressed communities. And here I would have loved for you to bring the example of the most oppressed communities, wherein the representation of their representation in the private sector is marginally below what is required of other communities as well. And therefore, there is no incentive for the private sector to engage in things like social mobility, social upliftment, eradication of these many factors. Because let's face it, this debate is not just about vouchers versus this. This debate is not just about cut in social sector. Cut in social sector consists of a lot of other things. If you're talking about the social sector, if you're going to cut spending on education and healthcare, you're going to take into account the society that you're talking about here. And here is where you had to contextualize India. Right? If the debate is taking place in India, you've got to contextualize India. It's not just a problem of what education is. It's not just a problem of about ki graduates hain, ki profit ka incentive hai. There are other aspects like social mobility, like caste, which are important to take into consideration here. And that is something which I thought was missing from the side opposition here. Finally, just to sort of conclude with by saying is that, again, I would have loved for this debate to have been set in a context of, as an adjudicator, I'm looking at the point of, I don't want to adjudicate a debate where they will say we will set up new schools versus you saying that we will send people with vouchers to schools. That's rather simplistic in nature. If that's the model of the debate, I clearly saw a problem with that because they were able to prove the point about expenditure very well. So that's the sort of essence of the debate. But as far as a much more proper debate would have been for, as an adjudicator or us as audience, to tell us that, look, there is a debate happening, right? There's a debate happening because people are angry. Why are people angry? People are angry because they're not getting the basic things that they want. What are those? Jobs, employment. Why aren't they getting those? Because the government isn't investing. Why isn't the government investing? Because it's too concerned with political symbolism. It's too concerned with bureaucratic inputs. You could have just given the example of many schemes which the government has now removed. Like, they're trying to remove things like Narega. Like, we have no political view here, as you know, right? But we are talking about the fact that why is the government doing it? Because it feels that too much expenditure has gone into it. Therefore, there is a need for a debate. And that's a much more solid way to begin your line of argument. And then you have to tackle and then your point about education, it's more not negated as such, but you've got to tackle it more. And simply by saying that, look, we'll set up more schools doesn't count, because they've laid out a context that we've already got so many graduates. So agar graduates hain और jobs नहीं है, तो फिर problem क्या? Education का point नहीं है फिर, right? I just want to answer one question there. The point about this entire Gandhi thing about self-sustainability is that you've got to go back to history here and realize that there was a lot of opposition to Gandhi's model of using the village and to decentralize everything. And the most bitter opponent was Ambedkar, right? Ambedkar talked about the village. And this is where more things besides decentralization and economic policy come in. Caste plays a very important role. Ambedkar stressed on the fact that, look, if you make the village the centerpiece of economic activity, the problem is that those who've already been on the fringes will continue to remain on the fringes. It was his famous quote to the Constituent Assembly. Yes, they've got political rights, yes, but the fact of the matter is, in this time, we'll be entering an era of one man, one vote, but we won't get one man, one vote, one value. And the value of that is social mobility, which is why the decentralized model has been opposed radically, particularly by followers and supporters of a particular political leaning. That's the sense of what I got from the debate. Again, I apologize if I intruded on my sort of line here, but I felt the need to sort of clarify on certain things. As far as the arguments are concerned, one point which I really want to highlight here is that you missed one very, very crucial point of the DLO speech. They never said we are against private participation. One very good point which, sorry, Dhruv, you are? Pranav, sorry, so I mistook your names, right. Dhruv's argument, and as I come from a private school, I've taught at a private school where there is EWS reservation, right? As a principal, he brought it out very well. He said that there is public-private cooperation in the sense that there is a government, and the government has introduced a scheme called a scheme for economically weak students, which the private schools now must take in the form of law. So in a sense, what you're doing is you are not necessarily against the involvement of the private sector, but rather the government is also taking an active step to make it much more cooperative here. And there I see scope for at least some kind of cooperation. There I see at least a nuanced perspective wherein government makes law and private sector has to follow. As opposed to here when you are, I'm not going to say abdicating responsibility, but rather you are shying away from the essential responsibility of a government. And they characterize the role of a government very well. So taking into account contemporary trends is very important because this government's particular agenda has been to talk about the fact that there are no jobs. So if you would have stressed on that aspect, the debate would have boiled down to much, much more than just your vouchers. Because then it would talk about what the important, not just the importance of those vouchers, but rather the importance of channeling that money for other things is. Channeling the money becoming more important. Again, like I said, I have no opinion as such. This is just my reading of this particular debate. So, thank you.
Okay, so by that, we come to the end of today's event. I think Patty's feedback would have answered all the unanswered questions. That's okay. I think because his feedback was quite extensive, reflecting both on the motion and what the team did. From YKA side, we sincerely hope that the debate and the discussion today was able to stimulate or nudge your own thinking and towards sustainable development goal and what kind of development paradigm we as a society and country should believe in and follow. The debate was live streamed. Also, it will be recorded and put out on our website. So feel more than free to share the video after you go back home and or refer to it in case you need it. Yeah, so that's it. Our website is www.youthkiawaaz.com. Everything that you see on our website has been contributed by users like you and I. There's no hierarchy on the kind of content that goes on YK. So any day, anytime, if you feel there's an issue that you want to write about or you want to voice yourself, all you need to do is to just send in a mail. Our entire editorial team is here today. So in case we have any questions about the entire process also, I think people will be more than free to answer it. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for coming in and taking out time.